The ribbon snaps like a gunshot, and cheers erupt, glitter cannons, TV crews, champagne spraying the white sand of my island. I stand 10 feet from the podium, salt wind in my face, watching bulldozers idle beside the infinity pool they poured over my wife's memorial. The HOA president, Linda Hale, basks under flashbulbs, promising public paradise, while her security eyes me like I'm trespassing on my own bloodline. The resort's steel bones glitter, generators thrum, yachts crowd the inlet anchors, biting into seagrass I mapped by hand. My drone hums overhead time, stamping every lie. They think I lost because I stayed quiet. They don't see the deed in my pocket, the surveys in my briefcase, or the clause they never read. When the tide turns tonight, it won't be the ocean that moves. It'll be the ground under their million-dollar mistakes. Before we dive in, drop your city and local time in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the twist. People think an island is just a dot of land with a postcard view. Mine is a ledger written in tides, dates, and a chain of signatures that goes back 103 years. My father used to say, "Water remembers what men forget." I thought it was poetry, until the day I learned to read a shoreline the way a lawyer reads a contract. Sand moves, grass creeps. The mean high water line, what the state calls the heartbeat of property, drifts like a slow needle across a patient's skin. If you don't chart it, your inheritance becomes a rumor. My island sits a mile off our sleepy harbor, half-moon-shaped, a crescent with a white scar of beach facing the mainland and a backside of marsh so green it looks neon from the sky. The old boat shed creaks at the north spit, and the only structure my father ever allowed was a single-story cabin tucked behind a seam of palms. It isn't much. A cement cistern, a tin roof, a porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs, one of which I keep empty in case his ghost ever decides to sit. Beneath that porch, I mounted a brass plaque for my wife Caroline. We used to count pelicans. She'd named the tamest one Frederick. I don't go to that rail much, not since the hospital, but the plaque is bolted deep. The 4 holes are sleeved with epoxy, the way Dad taught me to set anchors in old wood so salt can't swallow them whole. When he died, he left me 2 things, the deed and a waterproof journal with the word Akratian underlined on the first page. If you ever sell, he wrote in a neat stubborn hand, sell the air last. The deed is as simple as a paper crown the island, and all accretion's there too, and as lethal as a reef. Accretion is slow victory. When the sea lays a new lip of land against your shore, and the law says that lip is yours, you mark it, you measure, you make dates, your allies. I did all of that. For 20 years, I was a coastal engineer who specialized in public projects, bulkheads, jetties, tide gates. After Caroline, I took partial retirement and gave myself simpler jobs, fix my father's dock log erosion, drink coffee in a boat whose engine I tuned by ear. I didn't think I had enemies. That was my first mistake. The HOA on the mainland is called Sandglass. It used to be a fishing town, then a gated dream. Custom mailboxes, bylaws, thick enough to stop a bullet, and a board that calls itself the stewardship. They inherited a community lake, 3 pocket parks, and a superiority complex. Then Linda Hale won the presidency on a platform of coastal access for all members. She is unnervingly good at cameras. Her voice sounds like policy even when she's improvising. She never says "I want." She says the community deserves. I met her once at a county meeting about dredging the inlet. She glanced at my name tag, smiled like she'd already memorized a dossier, and floated a sentence that felt like a test balloon. "So you're the gentleman with the island. Not a question, not friendly." The sort of line a realtor uses before she pretends your house belongs in her brochure. "No, ma'am," I said, because I was raised to be polite to people who can hurt me. "The island is with me, belongs to my deed." "Deeds," she said to the room, "can be corrected." Everyone chuckled like it was nothing. But I watched her eyes track the county maps at the front of the room, the ones that showed my crescent as an unlabeled blot. That's when I wrote a note to myself, update survey this quarter. The first trespass announced itself in the engine note of a flat barge, too heavy, too confident, sloshing through the inlet at a speed that pushed wake into the manatee zone. I was on my dock with a thermos. The barge wore a Sunrise logo, Blue Harbor Resorts. Behind it came 2 skiffs, with flagging tape fluttering from their bows. Men hopped onto my beach like they were stepping off a shuttle bus. I called out then, regretted it instantly because shouting has never convinced a man who arrived to ignore you. Morning, a foreman yelled like he was delivering flowers. "We're here to stake the pier." The pier for what member access? HOA project. This is private property. I lifted my phone and took a photo of the first boot print on the dry sand above the rack line. "You're trespassing." He nodded like I'd explained Tuesday to him on a Tuesday. "We've got permissions." He pulled a crumpled paper from a clipboard printed map, a cloud of pink highlighter over my island, and the words, "Annexed parcel," in block letters, signed last week. Quitclaim deed recorded at the county. He turned the page to show the Cherry public purpose amenity expansion. He and I stared at the word public until the waves made it sound like a joke. I kept my face still the way you keep your hands still over a struck match. Who signed the quitclaim, I asked. The association. He tapped his logo again. Blue Harbor's the contractor. The HOA has title. You're telling me Linda Hale deeded herself my island. I let the sentence hang there, a linen snapping on a clothesline. He shrugged. Somewhere under my ribs, something broke and slid into a quiet place. Call the office if you want to, he said, walking past me like there wasn't a world ending beneath his boots. We've got a ribbon to make. For exactly 9 seconds, I let anger script my next move. In those 9 seconds, I pictured cutting lines, spiking tires, swinging the oar that leaned against my railing. Then my father's handwriting came back to me, water remembers. I took a breath that tasted like anchors. I took another photo. Then I went to the cabin and unscrewed the gunmetal box from under the sink, the one with the drone, 2 memory cards, and the laminated survey points I'd taped to tongue depressors. I had never planned to be a spy on my own land, but nothing in my life was planned after the ICU. The next days taught me everything I needed to know about Linda's style. When a letter from me arrived, certified, notarized, polite to a fault, an HOA newsletter appeared the same afternoon, calling me a recalcitrant holdout, obstructing a community recreation vision. When I flagged the county with a preservation, notice a code officer appeared on my dock to measure the legal width of my mailbox post. When I asked the harbor master about heavy equipment operating near the manatee zone, a volunteer with a body cam wobbled through my mangroves like a lost goose. The game wasn't to win a debate. It was to tire me into impropriety and catch it on video. So I did the opposite. I installed a dash cam in my skiff and a body cam on the strap of my Tide Pack. Every morning before sunrise, I launched the drone from my porch and flew a slow figure 8 over the barge and the beach. The camera tilted just enough to capture the datum boards I placed along the dunes. I logged every delivery and tail number, each pallet of Greenspan lumber and sack of cement. When they brought in a sonic hammer to drive pilings, I filmed the interval of the strikes to estimate depth. I am a courteous man by nature, but courtesy doesn't mean yielding your name to a thief. On the 3rd day, they brought the bulldozer. They cleared a path from the barge landing to the cabin. I was on the porch when the blade pushed through the grass and glinted off the brass. The driver hesitated at the plaque for maybe a second. Then he leaned into the lever, and the blade bit the wood like a shark. The sound it made was less a crash than a stunned intake of breath. The plaque slid, bounced, and vanished under sand and tire tread. I learned something about grief then. Grief isn't thunder, it's ductwork. It channels air wrong for a long time. I didn't yell. I didn't run down the steps. I thumbed the record button. Then I went inside and took a picture of Caroline from the drawer where I keep the good scissors. I propped it on the counter and told her I was sorry I'd let polite letters talk to wolves. She would have smirked. About time, she would have said, "You're at your best when you're stubborn." By the end of the first week, the project had a name, Sandglass Shores. They erected a vinyl banner on the barge with a nearly obscene amount of optimism. Renderings showed boardwalks over marsh grass and a glittering shingled lodge where my cistern sits. On the banner, the marsh was a tasteful green smear. In real life, it glowed like a warning. I didn't need to pick a fight. I needed to stack facts. So I visited the county recorder's office with coffee for the clerks and time on my hands. I requested the quitclaim deed. The paper they slid across the counter had my parcel number, an exhibit map, and a notary acknowledgement so clean it felt airbrushed. The signature block said the prior owner granted all right title and interest to Sandglass Community Association. The prior owner, according to the block, was me. "That's not my signature," I said softly. The clerk's eyes flicked to me with the sympathy of someone who knows a storm when the light changes. "We don't validate authenticity," she said. "We record what's presented." She leaned in a fraction. "But if you need the notary's log, it's public record. The stamp number's here." Her finger tapped a tiny smug circle of ink. I thanked her and copied the number like it was a coordinate. It turned out the notary worked 2 towns over in a UPS store that smelled faintly of toner and rubber bands. When I asked to view the log for the date on the deed, the manager flipped pages and frowned. "Huh," he said. "We were closed that Sunday." He let me take a photo of the page anyway, neat entries, before and after a gap on that date like a dropped stitch. Somewhere inside me, the ductwork rearranged. Air flowed better. Back home, I drafted 3 letters. The first to the HOA, a demand to cease trespass, preserve all documents and communicate solely in writing. The second to Blue Harbor Resorts and their insurer notice of title defect, reservation of rights, and an instruction that any construction after receipt would be at their risk. The third to myself, a promise written in plain pen that I would not speak a single sentence I didn't want read into evidence. I taped that promise above the kitchen sink next to Caroline's picture. On day 10, Linda arrived by pontoon boat wearing a white linen suit that didn't dare touch a speck of the island's actual dirt. 3 men flanked her in polos, board members, I guessed, or expensive echoes. She raised a hand like a queen to a subject and smiled without showing teeth. "Mr. Hale," she said. "That isn't my name," I answered. I watched the twitch at the corner of her mouth when she realized I'd demoted her by refusing a script. "Mr. She glanced at a folder, then dropped the pretense. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. You stole my land." I tilted my head toward the bulldozer trench. "You ran a blade through my wife's memorial. You signed my name on your own paper." She looked finally at the trench, and I caught it a flicker of something like human. Then it hardened. We acted under counsel and recorded instruments. The community deserves shoreline access. You can be part of that, or you can stand in front of it. She held out a document like a trick flower. "Here's a license agreement. Generous terms. Naming rights to the fishing pier. Caroline's Walk." I let the silence stretch until even the gulls gave up. Then I said, "Your problem isn't access, Miss Hale. It's the tide." She blinked. "People like her hate metaphors because they can't file them. You built your case on a line that moves," I said. And I brought a tape measure. She tucked the paper away as if I'd bitten it. "We open in 60 days, she said, turning toward the boat. "Be reasonable." "I intend to be," I said. "A judge will find that refreshing." The pontoon backed out her linen, bright as defiance, and I realized my heart had settled into something not quite calm and not quite vengeful. Purpose, maybe. Purpose with the scent of diesel and paper. That night, I spread my father's journal on the porch table and mapped the mean high-water line across 5 years of my drone photos. I marked the accreted spit that now wrapped behind the marsh like a new knuckle. I overlaid county plats that misdrew the shore as a straight line, as if sand respects rulers. Then I drafted a quiet title complaint in my head while the generator hummed near the beach and party lights flickered like a carnival that mistook itself for a lighthouse. They were building around me like they'd already won. That made them careless. Carelessness is a gift if you have patience and a camera. I took one more flight, a slow arc over the whole site. Pilings shone like a row of silver teeth. The resort renderings promised a lobby of glass, a coastal culinary experience, and a boardwalk that would let members watch sunsets over marshland that had learned to shrug off storms. I recorded the thump-thump-thump of a hammer driving a stake too far landward of the wetland flag. Then I brought the drone home by sound like a parent calling a kid at dusk. When its feet touched the porch, I checked the timestamp and whispered to Caroline, 60 days. It didn't feel like a deadline. It felt like a fuse I was content to watch burn, measuring every spark until the one that mattered. Construction exposes the character of the people doing it. Good builders measure twice when no one's watching and pack out their own trash when the truck is late. Bad ones kick rebar into the marsh and say the tide will take it. Blue Harbor had both kinds, which was useful. I didn't need them to be villains. I needed them to be themselves on camera, on paper, and on payroll records that could be subpoenaed later. I started with names. Names become testimonies when added to dates. The foreman who'd waived the quitclaim called himself Denny. His badge said, "Dennis R. Collar Site Sup." I learned he preferred lukewarm gas station coffee and used brother in a way that tried to collapse distance. The crane operator, Kendrick Louise, wore a faded cap with a pelican stitched off-center and whistled the same 3 notes before each lift. The environmental sub wore brand-new waders and called cattails nice reads. I wrote it all down in a waterproof notebook with a pencil that could scrape a thought into stone. I always greeted them. I always stepped aside. I always filmed from the edge of my right-of-way body cam, blinking like a lazy firefly. The first week after the bulldozer took Caroline's plaque, they laid out strings and batter boards for the main lodge, an L of glass promised in a rendering taped to a plywood wall. I flew the drone at dawn, panning slow and low enough to read the red Sharpie notes on their layout, foyer divided by kitsch divided by mech. I set my flight path to cross-datum boards I'd planted at high points along the dune. Each board bore a stenciled letter and a mark at last season's mean high water line. The camera saw everything the way a tide sees, everything without opinion but with perfect memory. I made public records requests, until my email looked like a fishing net: line items, attachments, server timestamps. I asked the county for communications between Sandglass HOA and Blue Harbor regarding amenity expansion and island access. I asked the state environmental office for any pre-application meetings. The first wave came back with predictable redactions, and one gift, a PDF of meeting minutes, where a junior planner had warned about mapped wetlands and a possible private title issue. The HOA attorney's response in the margin, captured in a scanned copy by some clerk who didn't realize black marker can be coaxed back to gray read: "Will record before any challenge possession is 9/10." I printed that page on thick paper so it would slap the table harder later. On day 13, a tug nosed in with a stack of treated pilings, each capped with a white plastic cone. I asked Denny where they drive, and he answered without checking whether he should. 2 rows centerline here. He thumped the sand with his boot, the way men have thumped land since we walked out of the sea. The first hammer drop set gulls screaming. The thud traveled through my ribs like a slow drum. I recorded the interval 8 seconds between blows and mapped penetration depth by the number of lifts per pile. Later, with a tide chart and soil assumptions, I could estimate how far below mean high water they punched those timbers. Below that line, the law behaves differently. Below that line, words like sovereign submerge start to walk into the room and sit down. I wanted those words seated politely behind me when we met the judge. I drove to the recorder's office again and started pulling the chain backward. Title is a rope. You tug on the knot you can see until the one you can't shows itself. My father had bought the island 47 years ago from a crabber who'd inherited it from an uncle who'd homesteaded it when the county still called it Unnamed Shoal. Each deed included the phrase that kept ringing in my skull like a bell: together, with all accretions there too. A plat from 20 years back, a lazy one, had drawn the shoreline as a straight line across my crescent, shaving off a new sand tongue that had grown after a hurricane. That blob of laziness had become the HOA's favorite exhibit. If the shore was a line, their annexation map could pretend straight lines made good fences over water. So I found the surveyor who'd drawn that lazy line. Retirement had given him a garden and the need to tell the truth without risk. He invited me to his porch and poured me iced tea that tasted like regret and lemon. "I hated that job," he said, flipping through my drone printouts with an old man's hunger to correct his own mistakes. The client wanted speed. We used county base layers. The aerials were post-storm. I should have set ground control and walked the marsh. No budget. He scribbled a correction on my copy and initialed it out of a habit he didn't try to break. "If you need me to explain accretion to a judge," he said, "I'll enjoy the day." I also renewed something my father had left sleeping: a submerged lands lease option with the state for a tiny notch of bottom adjacent to my dock. He'd secured it decades ago to protect against someone mooring a floating billboard in our inlet. Options have expiration dates. This one was within a window the statute still allowed to reactivate for the same riparian protection purpose. The clerk at the agency sounded surprised anyone remembered the file. "We still have the originals," she said. "Smells like the 70s. I filed the renewal quietly. A lease option on that notch was a finger wedged in a door Linda thought she could slam. Meanwhile, I drafted a conservation easement with a land trust I'd volunteered with after Caroline. It wasn't recorded. Not yet. But the language was tight: marsh buffer, wildlife habitat prohibition, on new commercial use without grantor consent. I told the director to hold it in the confidential drawer with my name on a sticky note. "You're playing long chess," she said. "My favorite kind." Back on the island, the lodge footprint turned into a ribcage of rebar. The deck forms for the infinity pool arced like a grin pointed at the inlet. I stood where the memorial had been and imagined teenagers cannonballing into water that had baptized every memory I owned. The anger was still there. I carried it the way divers carry a knife: useful, dangerous if you forget it's sharp. I filed a notice with Blue Harbor's insurer citing potential title defect and encroachment onto privately held accreted lands. Insurers like early warning. It lets them say reservation of rights and sleep better. The letter forced them to log a claim number, assign an adjuster, and send somebody in a decades-old sedan to take photos. He arrived on day 18 wearing steel-toe boots that had never met steel. He took 10 pictures of the same cypress knee and squinted at my deed, like it had personally offended him. I thanked him for coming. I do not dislike messengers. They keep receipts. My drone archive bulged file names in the thousands each, stamped with GPS altitude gimbal angle. I bought 2 more hard drives and mirrored them. One went into a safe deposit box at the bank. The other went into a friend's attic, 2 towns inland. I printed a map of camera locations and laminated it. Without redundancy, evidence is gossip. With it, evidence becomes a choir. On day 21, the harbor master started calling me first. Heads up, he'd say they've scheduled a night pour. Night work in a sensitive inlet makes regulators cranky. The noise carried across the channel like a bad rumor. I filmed the concrete pump truck's boom snaking above the dunes. I caught the moment a worker rinsed a chute into the fringe of marsh, the slurry clouding the edge like sour milk. The next morning I emailed the clip to the state with the subject line, "Potential discharge to jurisdictional wetlands, please advise." They advised with a form letter, but a biologist's follow-up call told me my subject line had worked. "We have nesting data for that fringe," she said. "We'll schedule a visit." Her voice had that tone field people use when they smell fraud and fresh paint. I filed litigation hold letters to the HOA, the developer, the engineer of record, and the environmental sub. "Please preserve," I wrote, "all communications, including texts and ephemeral messages, site diaries, batch tickets, inspection logs, and drone footage." Their counsel sent back a letter with the vocabulary of indifference. Perfect. The indifferent always save less than they should, and juries love the word spoliation. The workers got used to me. Some began to nod in a way that warmed me against my will. On a hot afternoon, Kendrick hopped down from the crane, wiped his forehead, and asked, "You really own this whole strip?" He didn't say it like a challenge, more like a weather report. "I do," I said. "And some of what they're building is below a line that doesn't belong to them." He looked out at the water the way men who work with heavy things look at lighter ones. "They pay on time," he said, "but they cut corners when the inspector's late." He kicked a small pile of offcuts and found his next sentence in the pile. "They told us the permit was good." I didn't answer because answers were for depositions. He nodded at the drone. "You're gonna win, aren't you?" I shrugged. He laughed without smiling. "You keep receipts," he said, climbing back into his cab. By day 30, Sandglass Shores had a website and a countdown clock. 72 days to paradise. In the background, a video panned across my inlet at golden hour, studiously framing out my cabin like a blemish. I archived the page 3 different ways and captured the developer's boast line by line. Board-approved annexation, new public-private partnership, enhanced coastal resilience. They said resilience, the way some men say amen, without understanding either. I spent a morning at the county GIS office asking about layers most applicants never see. One analyst showed me a glitch, an offset in the 2010 aerial mosaics that skewed shorelines a few meters seaward. Any map born from that skew would lie by inches that felt like feet. The annexation map bore that vintage. I asked for the metadata. He emailed it with a subject line that started with interesting. By then I'd assembled my wall, the lazy plat with the straight-line shore, the corrected sketch with the accreted spit, drone stills with date overlays, the notary log showing a Sunday signing on a day the store was closed, a screenshot of Linda's soundbite about coastal access for all members next to an email where her treasurer fretted about special assessment exposure if title goes sideways. I printed the HOA bylaws too, because bullies always hide behind rules. On page 17, a line yawned wide enough to sail a settlement through no encumbrance or conveyance of common area without a 2/3 vote of all members at a duly noticed meeting. Meeting minutes revealed a board action between meetings ratifying the amenity expansion, no membership vote. I circled the clause and slept better. One evening, as the sun turned, the marsh copper and the pool forms stretched like a grin that had gone on 2 beats too long. I propped my father's journal open to the page where he'd underlined Acrachean. I added my own word beneath it, patience. Water writes history in millimeters. Courts read in pages. My job was to give both the same story. When the generator hiccuped and caught again, I realized I could trace the whole site by sound. The crane's groan, the compressor's hiss, the slap of hose against plywood, the low animal yell of a man moving something heavier than sense. It didn't scare me anymore. It sounded like a clock, not a countdown to their victory, a countdown to mine. If arrogance builds insecurity in forces, the day Sandglass Shores launched a countdown clock, Sandglass HOA launched a pressure campaign. It started as a whisper, then arrived in my mailbox like junk mail in a tuxedo, a notice of compliance deficiencies accusing me of improper shoreline maintenance, unauthorized obstructions, and my favorite aggressive navigation in a community, waterway. My skiff tops out at 6 knots with a tailwind and a prayer. Aggressive it is not. Still, the letter had the tone of a middle school principal who found a slingshot during finals week. The fines came next. $50 a day for blocking amenity construction access. $100 a day for failure to remove debris from a trench the bulldozer carved through my dune. $200 a day for non-cooperation with authorized board representatives. The HOA stationery made extortion look like an invitation. Each envelope had a smiley lighthouse watermark. I logged every page, photographed every postmark, and paperclipped each to the day's drone stills. A story is easier to believe when the chapters are in order. The smear campaign bloomed like mold. Overnight, a community newsletter hit mailboxes with my photo cropped from a county meeting years ago under a headline that tasted like battery acid. Holdout blocks shoreline access for all. The article called me a squatter on community resources and implied I'd harassed workers. They quoted eyewitnesses who described me shouting obscenities and throwing tools. I don't throw tools, I sharpen them. On the back page, a spread of renderings promised family sunsets over a boardwalk that would have to levitate to avoid violation of 3 different wetland buffers. When smear didn't make me shout, they tried theater. A code enforcement officer, young and nervous, stepped off a pontoon boat onto my dock with a clipboard held like a shield. 2 HOA volunteers filmed from behind him, narrating like low-rent documentarians. Subject is approaching. Subject appears agitated. I was holding a coffee. Morning, I said, keeping my voice where the microphones couldn't later call it anything else. Badge and jurisdiction. He flushed and produced a laminated card that said he handled garbage cans and porch refrigerators. We received a complaint about, a illegal structure, he said, gesturing to my cabin built before his parents met. Your jurisdiction stops at the mean high water line, I said, pointing to a datum board. You're standing on a private dock, on private accreted lands, with a camera crew from a private homeowners association. Would you like water? He blinked. The volunteers whispered. I watched his shoulders fall into the relief truth gives decent men. Please, I added, put your questions in writing. They left with footage of me saying please, which didn't cut well for them. The next clip they tried was better, a staged trespass complaint by a board member who boated over to my beach, threw down a towel, and filmed himself yelling, "This is public," until I walked into the frame and said, "You're trespassing." He grinned like a fisherman whose hook finally found a jaw. "Threat," he shouted at his camera. I pointed to the boundary line and read him a sentence from my deed. The clip they posted used a jump cut to trim the sentence into a growl. My lawyer would later show the full version to a judge, and the judge would ask why adults had time for such dishonesty. I didn't file my quiet title suit yet. I needed their comfort to harden into complacency. Meanwhile, I set the table. Litigation hold letters went out on firm letterhead to the HOA, Blue Harbor Resorts, the engineer of record, the environmental sub, the PR firm. And because I wanted Linda to feel watched personally, to her Gmail, which she used for HOA business. Please preserve all communications I wrote, including but not limited to emails, texts, messaging apps, ephemeral messaging platforms, cloud drives, drone footage, time cards, batch tickets, inspection logs, pay when paid correspondence, edits to public-facing web content. Their counsel responded with a paragraph that said, "Everything and nothing. Good. When people think preservation is a suggestion, judges hear spoliation." The pressure spilled into the harbor. A bored sheriff's deputy idled near my cove one afternoon, lights off, windows down. He waved when I waved. After 10 minutes, he announced himself over the PA like a high school DJ. "Sir on the dock got a minute." His voice had the practiced calm of a man who's seen worse but not here. He wanted to make sure we all stayed neighborly. I told him we would as soon as the felony forgery and trespass stopped. He swallowed his smile. "You're recording me, aren't you?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "and I will FOIA your body cam so we can match memories." He laughed for real. "God, I love a careful man," he said, and motored off. Later at the grocery store, he passed me in the cereal aisle and tapped his card against mine like a gavel. "Keep it boring," he whispered. That I could do. Allies arrived slowly, the way tide makes a flat rock shine. The county surveyor, a woman whose patience could anchor a bridge, called after reviewing my drone overlay and the lazy straight-line plat. "It's bad cartography," she said. "I'll say so in court." The harbor master, a man who knows every sandbar by the sound of a hull skimming it, started emailing me berth reservations for Blue Harbor's supply barges. "Looks like night offloads," he wrote. "Regulator Candy." A retired judge, my neighbor, 2 streets inland, invited me to his porch, poured bourbon that tasted like oak and caution, and said, "You have the right facts. Don't lose them in the wrong story." He taught me to write a complaint like a novel act, structure themes, exhibits that talk to each other. The resort accelerated like a guilty driver at a yellow light. Pool rebar became a shell. Villas rose in a clapboard blur. A pier reached long fingers into the channel, its pilings wrapped with shiny collars. The contractor swore were turtle, safe. They were not. The environmental sub posted a photo of a heron enjoying our new habitat on Instagram and tagged Sandglass Shores. In the background, an orange wetland flag stood ironically inside a footprint. I screenshotted it, then cached it thrice. The post vanished by morning. My copy never would. I kept my humor where only I could hear it. When a bored volunteer trailed me down the beach, narrating subject is collecting shells to later plant false evidence, I picked up a beer can their crew had left and said, "Behold a wild accretion in its natural habitat." He didn't laugh, but the audio did. Then came the public safety letter, certified stern, claiming my refusal to coordinate forced the HOA to install temporary security. 2 private guards in ill-fitting black polos started standing by the pool, Forms Radio's hissing drama. They filmed me filming them until the scene ate its own tail. One afternoon, a guard told me with solemn menace, "You're on thin ice, sir." We were standing on a beach at noon in July. "Bless your heart," I said too, Southern for my bloodline, but just right for the moment. I shifted tactics from collection to subtle disruption, not of work but of comfort. I sent Blue Harbor a spotter's notice highlighting that their coastal permit, when I finally pried it loose through the state portal, had 3 express conditions. 1, no work within 50 feet of map nests during breeding season. 2, silk curtains deployed during all in-water operations. 3, no concrete washouts to wetlands. I attached time-stamped photos of violations for each. The project manager's reply was a temper tantrum in professional font. "Our operations meet or exceed all requirements," he wrote. His email footer included a graphic that said, "Building tomorrow." I replied with a still of slurry milk and marsh grass, and the caption, "You're building yesterday." The state biologist visited on a Thursday and stayed for 3 hours. She crouched where the pool deck would float above cattails and pushed a gloved finger into a mound of sand that still held the faint outline of a nest cup. Her eyebrows did a quiet arithmetic eggshell timeline. She measured rote notes and thanked me for the drone clips. "We get a lot of complaints," she said. "We don't get a lot of evidence." On Monday, a notice of probable violation landed in Blue Harbor's inbox and copied the HOA. I didn't gloat. My camera did it for me. I sent a letter to the bank listed on the developer's glossy brochure. It was polite and devastating the way a well-folded paper can be. I enclosed the notary log that contradicted the Sunday, signing the lazy plat versus the corrected shoreline, and the HOA bylaw requiring a 2/3 member vote for any conveyance of common area. "Your collateral," I wrote, "rests in part on improvements placed upon accreted lands titled to me and on an annexation of questionable validity. Please consider the effect of a recorded lis pendens on your anticipated refinance." Banks do not fear ghosts or gods. They fear clouds on title. The loan officer's voicemail came in the next afternoon, measured wary, suddenly interested in clarifying a few points. I didn't call back. I wanted him to read my points again alone. Smear 2 arrived when the HOA staged a community day on the beach tables of lemonade kids in branded t-shirts, a local TV crew filming B-roll of shovels biting ceremonial sand. I watched from my porch as Linda declared the project a triumph of shared vision over solitary obstruction. The camera panned past the trench, where Caroline's plaque used to sit. The director asked for a shot of community spirit, so volunteers strung a bunting of pennants between 2 stakes jammed right through a clump of seagrass. The state lists as protected. I filmed the stake going in the pennant, snapping the volunteer, stepping back proudly into a nest depression without seeing it. Later on the evening news, the bunting fluttered as an emblem of joy. In my archive, it fluttered as Exhibit 32. Pressure invites mistakes. After the broadcast, an email leaked forwarded by a member who didn't like being lied to. It was from the HOA treasurer to Linda. "We cannot afford continued daily fines if DEP formalizes violation." Also, members are asking why there was no vote on annexation. Linda's reply was 1 line with a full stop after each word. "We will not blink." I printed it in color and taped it next to my sink under my promise not to say anything I didn't want read in court. It felt like a sibling to that promise, a vow to let them talk themselves into a corner. The cops tried once more. 2 patrol cars, polite, called to a disturbance. A young officer asked if I had permission to be on the beach. I handed him my deed and a copy of the HOA bylaw's voting clause. He read, mouth barely moving, then handed the papers back and said to his partner, "We are leaving." The partner looked at Linda, who'd followed them down like a queen arriving to judge a pie contest, and said, "Ma'am, this is civil." She glared the way storm clouds glare at roofs indiscriminately and with no effect on shingles. They left. She stayed and smiled like she'd invented daylight. "You're alone here," she said, soft enough. The camera wouldn't catch it. "No," I said, looking at the tide. "I'm outnumbered." By the end of the month, the resort had walls and a glass grin. The HOA had invoices and headaches. The developer had a notice of probable violation on his desk, and a bank suddenly allergic to risk. And I had a record so clean it hurt to look at time-stamped drone arcs, emails like breadcrumbs, a notary log that refused to lie, an ex-surveyor eager to repent, a county analyst's metadata, a biologist with measurements, a harbor master with birth logs, a retired judge with bourbon and structure, and a community starting to realize that board meetings can look like parades on TV and still be heists on paper. At dusk, I sat where the plaque used to be and looked at the pool skeleton catching the last Sunday. The thrum of generators rolled over the channel like distant thunder, steady, arrogant, unafraid. I thought about Caroline's laugh, when I once told her a tide chart is a promise kept by the moon. "Then we can wait," she said. And we did, through chemo, through nights that clicked like bad pumps, through mornings that never got warm enough. Waiting isn't passivity. It's pressure in the right direction. I folded the bank's voicemail into my mental file and drafted one more letter, short, sharp, final. "Effective on the morning after your ribbon cutting, I will record a lis pendens and file a quiet title action. Please govern your loans and bookings accordingly." I hit send and slept 8 hours for the first time since the barge nosed in. Somewhere across the channel, Linda wrote another newsletter. Somewhere under the pool form, a nest waited for a decision it couldn't vote in. The tide crept millimeter by millimeter toward a line that moves for no one. The ribbon snapped at noon on a Saturday that pretended to be wholly blue sky gulls, drawing lazy punctuation over the inlet, a brass quartet playing a hymn to money. I stood in the back of the crowd in a clean shirt and a hat I'd reserved for funerals. The new sign read "Sandglass Shores" in script, so airy it might float off the pilings. Champagne misted the pool like rain that had lost its way. Linda's voice carried across my sand, a triumph of community. And I memorized the syllables so I could quote them later with the exact date, the exact time, the exact latitude and longitude stamped by my drone. When the last confetti fluttered onto my grass and the last influencer stopped pretending to adore sea oats, I walked home across my own beach and brewed coffee strong enough to file papers on, at 8:01 a.m. Monday, while the lobby still smelled like celebratory lemons and wet money, I recorded a lis pendens against the resort parcel. The county clerk stamped it with a number that felt like a countdown 0. In the same building, with the same calm, I lodged a quiet title action and a claim for ejectment and damages. "You're moving fast," the clerk said. "I've been moving slowly for 60 days. I answered and slid a copy into the envelope addressed to the bank. Lis pendens is Latin for "we're not done here." It handcuffs a liar's escrow and shoves a question into every buyer's due diligence report. I'd prepared the affidavit like a sermon chain of title back a century. The accretions clause underlined overlays of the mean high water line, proving several public structures sat below a line. The state cares about drone stills of pilings sunk, where sovereign submerged lands begin the Sunday notary stamp that never happened. The HOA bylaw clause requiring a 2/3 member vote for any conveyance, the absence of such a vote. I swore to every line because I could. The judge assigned to my case, Talia Morgan, was a former admiralty lawyer who wore her hair like an argument you wouldn't win. Her clerk smiled like a man who enjoys good exhibits. When you spend months collecting receipts, handing them over feels like passing a torch to someone who knows how to set arsonists alight without raising her voice. Service went out that afternoon. HOA headquarters, Blue Harbor Resorts, their counsel of record, the engineer of record, the environmental sub, and yes, Linda, personally at her porcelain kitchen island, accepted by adult resident as the sheriff's affidavit so kindly phrased it. At 4:02 p.m., my phone buzzed with a bank officer's email proposing an urgent call to discuss potential resolution pathways. I didn't return it. I wanted the bank walking into the courtroom holding humility like a bouquet. Before close of business, I filed for a temporary restraining order to suspend resort operations pending determination of title and compliance. The motion included an emergency declaration from the state biologist about the nest cups she'd measured under the pool frame and a sworn statement from the harbor master regarding unpermitted night offloads. I attached the HOA treasurer's panicked email. "We cannot afford continued daily fines if DEP formalizes violation," and the line I loved more each time I read it. Linda's credo: "We will not blink." The law doesn't care about bravado. It cares about the weight of facts. Mine weighed so much, the digital filing portal wheezed when it swallowed them. Blue Harbor hired a crisis PR firm and a second law firm that bills in 3 digits per hour before the decimal. Their response landed fast, a memorandum calling me a disgruntled former resident. I live here, and the island community common area by annexation, it is not. They painted my quiet title action as an attempt to shake down a beloved amenity, and me as litigious to the point of pathology. They attached the lazy straight-line plat as if ink could bully tide. They didn't attach the notary log because they didn't have it. I did. The hearing for the TRO was set for Friday morning. I spent Thursday night at my porch table, making sure each exhibit had a best friend, the notary log side by side with the Sunday deed. Drone stills annotated with tied data and gimbal headings. The HOA bylaw page circled in red with meeting minutes that showed no vote. The state biologist's photos of the nest cups paired with the Instagram post of a volunteer spearing a pennant through seagrass. The harbor master's birth logs next to my night footage of concrete washout. I laminated my map overlays, not because judges need lamination, but because I needed tactile proof I'd brought bricks, not smoke. Friday morning, the courthouse smelled like floor wax and good intentions. Judge Morgan took the bench with a stack of binders that made me like her even before she spoke. Blue Harbor's counsel, smooth, expensive, optimistic, opened with a bark about economic harm to hundreds of families and irreparable damage to the community's trust if the resort were paused. He claimed I'd sat on my rights like a cat on a fence. He said public interest enough times it started to sound like a ringtone. Then he held up the annexation map, that straight-line cartoon, like a saint might hoist a relic. When it was my turn, I stood adjusted a tie I wear once a year and spoke the way a man speaks when he's had to memorize the exact shape of grief and the exact depth of a pile below mean high water. Your Honor, I said this case is heavy, with words that feel like feelings, community access, amenity. None of them outweigh title. I walked her through the rope deed to deed to deed, each with the accretions clause. I pointed to the lazy plat, and then to my corrected overlay, with the accreted spit growing like a thumb. You cannot annex a lie, I said, and you cannot convey common area without the vote your own bylaws require. I laid down the notary log like a trump card. They recorded on a Sunday, I said. The store was closed. In the back of the room, Linda's jaw ticked small and furious the way a clock ticks right before you realize you're late. The state biologist testified in a voice that could convince a hurricane to reschedule. She talked about nest windows and washouts. She held up a photo that looked like a spoon pressed into morning bread. The harbor master spoke of offloads and permits. The retired surveyor confessed his straight-line sin and initialed his correction on an easel like a man repairing a bridge plank with pilgrims watching. The bank's lawyer, to his credit, said very little, just enough to signal that if the court found a cloud on title, their interest would be materially affected. He pronounced materially the way you pronounce get us out of this. Blue Harbor's counsel cross-examined like a man trying to sculpt fog. He asked me whether I'd provoked volunteers by filming them. I preserved evidence, I said. He asked whether I'd blocked access by existing where I have a right to exist. I stood still, I said. He asked if I had animus. I have a deed, I said, and the courtroom laughed in the soft, permissible way that doesn't insult the bench. Judge Morgan granted the TRO. Her words landed like anchors. Operations paused. No occupancy, no further construction on or below alleged mean high water line, preservation of all documents and media, access for the state to survey and for the county surveyor to perform a court-authorized retracement, order to show cause why the annexation isn't void for failure to obtain the required member vote. The sheriff posted the notice on the resort's glass doors, while influencers were still posing with their first-night keycards. The lobby went from grin to grim in an hour. A couple in matching white linen stared at the paper like it was an abstract painting. It wasn't. It was law temporarily breathing on my behalf. The aftermath moved fast in the brittle way ice moves when it decides to be water again. The bank froze the second draw on Blue Harbor's construction line. The insurer issued a reservation of rights letter you could iron shirts on. The HOA's newsletter arrived late and shrill, calling the court misinformed and me obsessive. I pinned it to my fridge behind my promise to speak like a witness, not a warrior. The PR firm launched a campaign about compromise, featuring a photo of a child on a boardwalk that doesn't exist. I put it next to Exhibit 32. Linda called a special town hall and packed the clubhouse with members wearily clutching folding chairs. I went and sat in the front row. She opened with a sermon about vocal minorities derailing shared dreams. I stood when she asked for questions and asked the only one that mattered. Did you hold the required member vote before conveying what you call common area? Silence is the most honest sound in politics. It lasted 4 beats. She said, our counsel advised, and a man in the back, the sort who builds 3 houses a year with his brothers and never misses a payment, stood and said, answer it. She didn't. The room began to turn like a tide that finds a channel and decides to use it. Over the next week, Discovery began to breathe. Subpoenas went out for emails, texts, minutes, group chats, drone footage, metadata. My litigation hold letters matured into something with teeth. The HOA's counsel filed a motion to limit scope. The judge denied it with a margin note that felt like a smile. Spoliation risk is real. Preservation is paramount. The Environmental Agency's probable violation converted into a formal notice with a compliance schedule that would cost someone more than they'd budgeted. The county surveyor marched the marsh with a staff and a notebook and returned with a line the annexation map could not swallow. One morning, I launched the drone and let it hover at 200 feet over the lobby doors, while workers idle and apologetic swept confetti that hadn't been allowed to dissolve into the story. Blue Harbor's project manager glared at the notice taped to the glass, the way a boy glares at rain that cancels the game. I didn't gloat. I had a hearing schedule to meet and a memorial to rebuild. At night, with the generators finally silent, the island sounded like itself again, small waves slapping pilings, fiddler crabs working their algebra owls, grading everything. I set Caroline's picture on the porch rail and told her what had happened in court. We're not finished, I said, but we showed them Tide has a lawyer. In the distance, the infinity pool held perfectly still, a trapped mirror. It would not open this season. It might never open as a place to drink and forget. I had other plans written in the rider of an old deed, and the patience of a man who counts pelicans because someone else taught him how. The morning after the TRO, Linda motored past in a skiff alone. No linen suit, no cameras. She slowed near my dock and stared like a traveler reading a sign in a language she doesn't want to learn. You could have taken the deal, she said. We offered your wife's name on a pier. I tapped the rail where the plaque had been. You bulldozed her first, I said. Now we'll rebuild in stone. The skiff idled. The tide turned with that subtle clutch you feel more than see. She opened her mouth, then closed it, and powered away without a word. I brewed coffee and opened my father's journal to the page where he'd written in underlined capitals, hold your line. A lis pendens is a line. A tro is another. So are the mean high water mark, and the bylaws the HOA failed to read. Lines brought us boats and bridges and fare maps. The resort for now was a glass grin frozen mid-laugh. Paper had hands. They were on its throat politely. The TRO stopped the party. The hearing on the preliminary injunction would decide whether the music stayed off for the season or for good. In the week between, Discovery peeled back like old paint. What flaked off wasn't pretty group texts where board members celebrated steamrolling the old guy. A draft newsletter titled Defamation Shield in the PR firm's Google Drive time-stamped photos of concrete washout relabeled test, water. We numbered everything. Evidence is a choir when it sings in order. Judge Talia Morgan called us at 9:00 a.m. Sharp bench stacked with 3 binders that had cost me a dozen late coffees and 2 new printer cartridges. Blue Harbor's counsel came ironed and unflappable. The HOA's lawyer looked like a man who had slept under a desk. Linda arrived in a gray suit that had nothing to do with linen or applause. I took the same seat I'd taken for the TRO and set my father's journal page marked at Hold Your Line inside my briefcase like a small, stubborn saint. The county surveyor went first. She rolled out a fresh mylar of the shoreline retracement, a careful lace of ticks and elevations, and clicked a pointer on the screen where the accreted spit wrapped like a knuckle around the marsh. The annexation map relies on a mosaic with a known seaward offset, she said, teacher calm. This retracement corrects that error. Several resort improvements sit on accreted uplands, titled to plaintiff, and parts of the pier sit below mean high water. Blue Harbor's counsel tried to sound breezy. Offsets are common, surely the public interest. She took a breath that stopped him better than a ruling. Surveying is arithmetic, not vibes, she said. I did not smile. My pencil did. Then the forensic document examiner took the stand, a woman whose glasses flashed like crosshairs when she looked at a signature. She projected the recorded quitclaim deed next to the notary's log and a magnified crop of the notary stamp. The kerning in the surname is inconsistent with contemporaneous exemplars, she said, laser dry. The notarial embossing pressure is uneven, suggesting overlay rather than one motion impression. The log shows the store closed. Blue Harbor objected to speculation. She lifted her chin. It's measurement, she said. Fraud looks like style. Authenticity looks like math. The judge glanced over her glasses at the defense table. The glance said, "This is the hole you fall into when you kick the ground too hard." I testified next. No speeches Judge Morgan's court didn't reward oratory. I did the workman's version, dates, files, photos, coordinates my body camera blinking like a metronome in the clips. Their cross came wrapped in insinuation. "You hate the HOA, don't you?" counsel asked. "I hate forged deeds," I said. "You disrupted their access," he tried. I stood on my dock, I said. "You hoped the resort would fail so you could feel powerful." "I hoped my wife's memorial would survive a bulldozer," I answered, letting the sentence lie there like a plank across a creek. He pivoted to the drone. "How many hours did you spend spying, documenting?" I said. "Enough to make sure memory didn't have to guess." The state biologist brought photos of nest cups and measurements that made laughter an unwise response. The harbor master brought birth logs and a voice that had ordered ships through storms. The retired surveyor confessed his straight-line sin again, this time with a humility that filled the room. When Blue Harbor attacked him for sloppiness, he nodded. "Yes," he said, "and now I fix it." Jurors love repentance. So do judges who have seen men fake it. The HOA's turn smelled like desperation in fresh folders. They brought a community benefits expert who pronounced sunsets like a deliverable. They paraded a mother who testified her children wanted a boardwalk. The judge thanked her and then asked the HOA counsel whether those children had been allowed to vote on conveying common area. He tried to laugh, then remembered where he was. "That clause is aspirational," he said. "No," Judge Morgan said, tapping the bylaws, "it is a rule." Her gavel made a small, satisfied sound. I drew a tiny check mark in the margin of my notes next to bylaw section 7.3. Then came the part I hadn't expected: the phone records. My lawyer had subpoenaed the HOA's group chat metadata after a member slipped us an email subject line that smelled like smoke. The return arrived the morning of the hearing, stamped and indexed with a gift in the middle, a 1218 a.m. Message from Linda to the board, sent 2 days before the Sunday deed reading. "We must have this recorded by Monday. If the notary won't meet, we find someone who will stamp. Eyes on the prize." The room made that tiny inhale courtrooms make when everyone grows up at once. The judge's pen paused. "Miss Hale," she said, "you will be hearing from me regarding this message." Blue Harbor launched a last assault, an economist to testify about sunk costs and how pausing operations would cost millions per quarter and devastate seasonal bookings. "Devastation is not a legal interest," Judge Morgan said, not unkindly. "Title is." The economist tried to explain community welfare. The judge asked whether community welfare included obeying bylaws requiring member votes. He said he couldn't speak to that. "Precisely," she said. By lunch, opposing counsel's tone had migrated from victory to salvage. The bank's lawyer rose surprisingly candid. "Your Honor, we seek to protect our collateral," he said. "We desire clarity more than speed." It was a surrender without white flags. The insurer's counsel echoed with the music of a reservation of rights letter. "Coverage may be affected by allegations of knowing falsification," she said. Linda's jaw ticked again. You could tell when she was counting the minutes between headlines. After lunch, the PR firm's project manager took the stand under subpoena. He was crisp until the exhibit started arriving screenshots of drafts with file names like Holdout, Smear, V3, Final, Final 2. My lawyer clicked one, a list of messaging pillars. Pillar 2 read, "Old man versus progress equals frame as eccentric obstruction." Pillar 4 read, "If sued, play shared vision and bridge building, and invite to ribbon in exchange for silence." The judge did not look amused by pillars. Counsel objected that public relations strategy is not relevant to title. "It's relevant to bad faith," the judge said, "and bad faith is relevant to fees." You could feel the HOA accountant, wherever he was, reach for a calculator and then for antacids. We ended with me. My lawyer asked one question. "Why did you wait until they finished to file?" I could feel the defense smile, finally a point. I told the truth. "Because when arrogant men draw straight lines across water, Your Honor, they commit their sins in concrete. I wanted the court to see them, and because I knew a lis pendens would freeze money better when the ice had already formed." Judge Morgan wrote something that looked like a star. Her ruling came the next morning. She spoke for 17 minutes, each one a brick. She found a substantial likelihood that 1. I held title to the island and its accretions, 2. The HOA lacked authority to convey any claimed interest without a 2/3 member vote. 3. The recorded quitclaim deed bore hallmarks of fabrication, including a notary log contradiction. 4 portions of the resort encroached upon accreted uplands and sovereign submerged lands. And 5. The balance of equities favored preserving the status quo. She converted the TRO into a preliminary injunction. Operations halted pending trial. Occupancy barred. She ordered a court-appointed special master, a crusty surveyor with the manners of a good compass, to retrace the shoreline and the mean high water line using new control points and a joint inspection by state regulators. She required Blue Harbor to post a bond to cover potential environmental remediation and ordered the HOA to escrow all amenity funds collected for the project pending resolution. Then she turned to sanctions. To the extent any party failed to preserve documents after receipt of litigation, hold letters, she said, looking over the rim of her glasses, this court will consider adverse inferences. She directed the HOA to produce the original notary journal if it existed, and the phones used for board communications for forensic imaging. The PR firm got an order to produce all drafts metadata intact. The bank was told to hang tight. The insurer was granted leave to intervene on coverage questions later, and then came the line that made Linda finally blink. Based on preliminary evidence, the judge said the court is referring the purported quitclaim deed and related filings to the state attorney for review. A referral is not a charge, it is a storm warning flag. The HOA's newsletter that week was a masterpiece of non-information. Temporary pause to ensure compliance with our high standards. It chirped as if the court had awarded them a trophy for neatness. Commenters were less polite. Who voted for this, a woman wrote. I sure didn't. Another asked whether amenity assessments would be refunded. Someone posted a link to the bylaws and highlighted the clause about member votes. The admin turned off comments, which might be the only honest thing they did all month. Blue Harbor's site removed the countdown clock. In its place, exciting updates coming soon. My favorite line from their email blast was committed to dialogue posted 2 hours after their counsel filed a motion, accusing me of weaponizing regulatory frameworks. I printed the email and stapled it to the motion. Exhibits like making friends. At home, the island exhaled. The generator cough ceased. The crane's groan became wind again. The pool sat still as a lie cooling on a plate. I found the brass plaque's bent corner in the spoil pile behind the dune. I wiped sand off Caroline's name and set the fragment on the railing where the light hits around 3. We're getting there, I said. One more tide. My father used to say courtrooms are just docks with rules. Everyone ties up, nobody rams. Judge Morgan kept that dock steady. When the preliminary injunction order arrived in crisp paper, I read it twice, then once aloud just for the pleasure of a sentence that begins, "It is hereby ordered," and ends with my land not being a metaphor any longer. The bank's lawyer called voice newly respectful. We'd like to discuss pathways, he said. I told him we could talk after the special master walked the line and after the state finished its inspection. He accepted that boundary like a man who has learned which lines burn. The insurer sent a letter saying coverage may be void if insureds knowingly submitted falsified instruments. The HOA board scheduled a leadership renewal discussion. A rumor said 2 directors had resigned. Another said 3. Rumors are useful, but I file them in a different drawer. The night after the ruling, Linda walked to the public beach across the channel alone. She stood at the water's edge and stared out at the dark bulk of the lodge, its glass reflecting stars it didn't earn. For a moment I felt a flicker of human, what it costs a person to believe a story so hard they gamble their name on it. Then I remembered the bulldozer blade shaving my wife's name into sand and the midnight text, "We will not blink. People can learn. Institutions rarely do without invoices." I brewed coffee and opened the journal again. Beneath "Hold your line," I wrote another line. Lines make harbors. The injunction was a line. The court's referral was a buoy. The special master's retracement would be a channel. And just beyond all that, under dust in a file my father left, there was another line. Even they hadn't seen yet the rider about fixtures and consent. Not for today. For when the tide finished its long syllable. For now I slept. The island kept the watch. The pool held its breath. The law hummed in the pilings like a tide running right. Special Master Abel Ramsey measured my shoreline like a hymn, steady stanza by stanza. He arrived with 2 rods, a yellow tripod, and a temperament bred by a lifetime of watching men argue with tape measures. For 3 mornings, he and the county surveyor ghosted through the marsh, pausing every few yards to write down the tide's true name. On the fourth, he folded his field book with a sound like a door closing and said lines not where their map pretended. His report drew the border like a seamstress, tracing a favorite shirt honest to the fabric. It placed the pool deck half the pier and 2 villas squarely on accreted uplands, titled to me, and several pilings beyond the mean high water line where sovereign rules live. Judge Morgan adopted the report. With it in the record, the case stopped being a weather conversation and became carpentry. Pieces fit, other pieces didn't. The court scheduled an accounting trespass damages, unjust enrichment, disgorgement of profits attributable to the invasion, and attorney's fees. The word disgorgement tasted medicinal. I liked that. Medicine doesn't ask whether you enjoy it. That same afternoon, the bank called again, this time with a tone that could pass for prayer. We're in a bind, the loan officer admitted. Your list pendants has frozen our refinance and our construction line, the bond requirements chewing cash. Could we discuss a structured resolution? I told him they were talking to the right man at the right hour for the right price. Start by assuming the annexation is void, I said. Assume the quitclaim dies where it lies. Assume you can't sell a window that's bolted to my wall, then tell me what you can live with. He didn't argue. He asked for time to confer with Blue Harbor and the HOA's carrier. Time is a negotiator's currency. This time I set the rate. The HOA smelled blood and called another town hall. The room had shifted since the injunction, less linen, more ball caps. People who never spoke at meetings spoke with receipts in their pockets. The treasurer resigned at the microphone and left the gavel on the dais like a failed crown. Linda took the stage with the expression of a person who can no longer tell whether she's on a podium or a plank. I sat front row, quiet as tide. We're pursuing all legal avenues, she began. You forged a deed, someone said. Our counsel, what member vote? Someone else asked, waving a printout of the bylaws. Section 7.3, circled in highlighter like the Sunday. She stared at the audience as if they were a mirror that had betrayed her. We will not. Blink, she said, as if repetition could replace proof. A woman 2 rows behind me stood and said evenly, We are blinking now. That's called waking up. The room hummed like a hive, remembering it has a queen only because it allows one. The insurer blinked first. Their reservation of rights flowered into something harder after the judge referred the deed to the state attorney. They appointed coverage counsel whose first act was to schedule examinations under oath of the board. Under oath concentrates the mind. Within a week, I received a tentative inquiry. If operational control shifted and remediation commitments were made, would you consider terms short of demolition? The email came from the bank but had the insurer's shadow behind it. I brewed coffee and printed the page. I met them at a long table in a glass conference room that tried too hard to look like a lighthouse. The bank, the developer, the HOAs, incoming outside counsel, not the ones who signed the last mess, and a man from the insurer who looked like he counted premiums in his sleep. My lawyer sat to my left, calm enough to win a horse race by walking. They opened with a mea sorta culpa, unfortunate cartographic reliance process breakdown urgency that led to regrettable expediency. I let the euphemisms stack like driftwood. Then I slid my list across the table. It wasn't short. Number 1 title quieted to me, full recognition of my ownership of the island and all accretions. You stipulate, you sign, you file. Number 2, the annexation is void. HOA acknowledges they lacked the member vote. County vacates the map. Assessments collected for the amenity are refunded with interest. Number 3, the forged quitclaims withdrawal and an apology to the recorder's office on letterhead that doesn't pretend to be perfume. Number 4, environmental remediation. You fund restoration of the marsh fringe, removal of unlawful pilings below mean high water, and habitat work under the state's plan. Endowed maintenance for 10 years. No balloon payments. Cash in escrow. Number 5, my wife's memorial. Rebuilt in stone deeper than your excuses. A quiet garden set aside by recorded instrument with her name, not as compromise but as restitution. Number 6, governance. HOA board resignations. President, secretary, and treasurer. Documented compliance training for the replacements. Independent counsel for a bylaws overhaul, explicitly preserving private title rights, riparian boundaries, and the voting clause you pretended was aspirational. Number 7, the resort. There are 3 choices. Remove encroachments and walk away. Sell me the improvements at a discount that recognizes you built them on land you didn't own, or convert the project to non-commercial uses under my control. The developer's lawyer bristled. We can't hand you a resort. I nodded. You already did. You just didn't read the receipt. The insurer's man steepled his fingers, which is insurance language for our abacus is out. What's your number, he asked. Disgorgement plus fees, I said. And a ground lease, if you want to keep using any improvements on my land, 30 years with escalators payable to me. No occupancy, until the state signs off. No operations without my consent. We'll never reopen, the developer asked, righteous wilt blooming at the edges. Not as this, I said. As something better, maybe. You stepped on a sanctuary and called it a sales pitch. We start from that sin and walk toward service. That's when the bank surprised me. What if the loan officer said shoreline villas became research housing leases to your foundation, not to tourists? The pool becomes rescue diver training. The pier becomes a state-monitored observation deck. Blue Harbor takes a loss and saves face by endowing a coastal lab. Silence can be tactical or sacred. This was both. I pictured Caroline's plaque in a garden where kids learn to read the tide the way you read a friend's face. I pictured a classroom where a crane used to strut pelicans landing on pilings that finally belonged to the right side of the line. The insurer liked the word endowment. The bank liked any sentence that ended without foreclosure. The developer liked the oxygen of a narrative change. The HOA had nothing left to like except survival. Add 2 conditions, I said. Operational control sits with me through a new entity, an independent research reserve. And the boardwalk you promised members becomes a public path along the non-sensitive edge built to the state's specifications. Open sunrise to sunset with 3 plaques. One that teaches accretion, one that warns about hubris, and one that tells a small true story about a man who put his wife's name in brass and meant it. The insurer's man said, "We'll pay for the signage." I shook my head. "You'll pay for the stone." We papered the deal over the next week with more clauses than a Dickens novel. The stipulation to quiet title read like a confession in Times New Roman. The county vacated the annexation. The HOA scheduled a member vote on a new board slate. The old guard stood down with statements that managed to be both contrite and evasive. The state signed a consent order remediation schedule monitoring plan fines commuted to habitat work. Blue Harbor executed a deed of improvements, not to me directly but to the new reserve, and the bank took a write-down that hurt enough to teach without killing. The insurer wrote checks, like a man filing weather. Judge Morgan approved the settlement with the caution of a woman who's seen parties slap bows on wrapped nonsense. She kept jurisdiction, retained the bond until the state nodded and set status dates like lighthouses up the coast. If any term fails, she said, we resume where we left off. Nobody wanted to resume. The apology came last. A camera, a lectern on my beach not far from where they'd chopped the old memorial's edge. The 3 resigning board members stood side by side. Linda in the middle gray suit, again a wind she couldn't control in her hair. I didn't write their words, but I edited them with the threat of court. They said what mattered: unlawful annexation, failure to hold a member vote, reliance on a deed they should have known to be false harm, to the marsh breach of trust. They said my name without rolling it in their mouths like a pebble. Then Linda looked at me, and for one clean second I saw a person, not a headline. We were wrong, she said. I was wrong. The wind stole nothing. It let the sentence land. I didn't clap. I nodded once and turned to the stone. We set the memorial with a small crowd and a big silence. 2 masons slid the slab into a cradle. I'd cast myself deeper than any tire could touch, her name crisp, unbothered by clouds. I pressed my palm to the surface and felt the cool, then the warmth my skin gave it, like the beginning of all agreements. The new garden wrapped around it, sea oats, a bench of weathered cypress, a little bronze pelican that looked suspiciously like Frederick. Kids from the mainland came the next week with notebooks. A biologist showed them how to read a nest the way my father taught me to read a line. The villas closest to the marsh traded sheets for bunks and microscopes. The pool held divers practicing rescues in visibility like tea. The pier sprouted interpretive signs instead of cocktail menus. Some folks missed the idea of sunsets with drinks. Most discovered sunsets with purpose get you drunker cheaper. At the next HOA meeting, members asked better questions. How does a vote work? Where do our rules stop? Who benefits when we rush? A builder in a ball cap volunteered for the bylaws committee. The treasurer's seat was filled by a woman who balanced a spreadsheet like a boat. The new president, chosen by a real vote, started the meeting with a sentence that made the room breathe right. We own only what we own. As for me, I signed the ground lease with a pen my father once used to write accretion in a journal that still smells like salt and sunlight. The lease paid enough to repair everything. Money can repair and seed a fund for what money mostly ignores: quiet, and the kind of education that keeps quiet strong. I accepted attorney's fees not as a trophy but as a receipt. This is what it cost to teach maps to men who thought cameras were mean. On the first morning of the reserve, I stood on the new boardwalk with the harbor master, the special master, the county surveyor, and the state biologist. We looked like the punchline to a bureaucratic joke. Then a line of pelicans sliced the dawn low and full of intent, and none of us spoke. Intent makes its own law if you let it. Linda passed on the path later that week, hands in her pockets, no cameras, no linen. She stopped by the interpretive sign about accretion and read every word. I didn't know, she said. It wasn't a defense, it was a postscript. You do now, I answered. She nodded at the memorial. It suits the place, she said. It suits the tide, I said, and she left with her head down, which is sometimes a prayer. At night, I hear the low murmur of students on the pier and the more profound language of water explaining itself to anyone patient enough to listen. The island is still a ledger, tides, dates, signatures, but it reads warmer now. Fewer invoices. More vows. Blue Harbor's new sign on the mainland points to the reserve. The bank calls the write-down a lesson learned. The insurer calls it concluded. I call it something my wife would have admired useful. We weren't done. Not quite. There was a page in my father's file I'd left unopened on purpose. Dusty short, burdened with a clause. Most men in suits forget because it doesn't look like money until it is. I placed it on my desk next to the ground lease and waited for a morning with enough light to read it aloud to the tide. When the last paperwork was signed and the reserve's first tide class ended, I brought the banker's pen and my father's leather file to the cabin table. The leather was cracked like riverbeds in August, and the brass snaps still clicked with the stubborn optimism of good hardware. I'd thumbed this file 100 times in the past months. Deed surveys, submerged lands, option tax receipts, the journal with Akritian underlined twice. But the sheet I wanted sat at the back, brittle and brown around the edges, titled in my father's tidy caps, rider fixtures, and unconsented commercial use. He'd added it when he bought the island, stapled through the closing packet with a conviction he never advertised. The language was spare. Any improvement erected upon these lands for commercial purposes, without the written consent of grantee, shall be deemed a fixture tendered under color of trespass and title. To such fixture shall upon demand revert to grantee without further act together with all appurtenances necessary for its peaceful use. The lawyer who drafted it had initialed each margin like a pianist touching keys before a performance. No flourish. Just intent hammered into nouns. I read it aloud the way you read a will you hope you'll never need. The words didn't gloat, they clarified. The resort's bones, pool, pier, villas were fixtures tendered under color of trespass. They weren't gifts. They were forfeitures waiting for a throat to clear. I had not shown this to anyone during the war. Leverage works best when it isn't a club you swing, but a door you're willing to open. But after the settlement, after quiet title, after the annexation died, after Linda's apology cut true, and the reserve's bunks filled with kids who could already tell you where mean high water sat by smell, I drove the skiff to the mainland, climbed the courthouse steps and recorded the rider with the clerk. She squinted at the date at the original book and page at the addendum that had haunted the edge of every decision I'd made. You saved this for dessert, she said. I saved it for the truth, I said. Now it belongs in the chain. That afternoon, the bank's counsel called with the wobble people get when they realize a storm they'd charted as past is in fact the second half of the same front. Are you invoking it? He asked. And the word invoking reminded me that law is just the ritual we invented to make fairness audible. No, I said, not today, maybe never. It lives here now to explain why we will not lose what we earned by patience. And to warn the next man who sees a marsh and thinks it's a brochure, I didn't call the developer. I didn't need to. In every meeting since the settlement, he'd floated the word legacy like a cork trying to be a buoy. It wasn't wickedness that built his resort on my island. It was appetite dressed in confidence. He'd lost money, and men like him don't forget the taste. But he'd signed the deed of improvements. He'd funded the endowment. He'd stood on the pier during the first rescue diver training and clapped when a 19-year-old surfaced, flushing with the shock of competence. He had a new narrative to sell at his next proposal. We fixed what we broke. Sometimes that's enough to reform a habit. The HOA, chastened in public and quieter in private, voted in bylaws that read like wisdom, private titles respected, limits of jurisdiction drawn in ink, common area conveyances bound to real votes, conservation seats on committees. A rule that no project touching water proceeds without a seminar on accretion taught by someone who heals wetlands for a living. Policy is a fence you build because you can finally see the cliff. On a Wednesday full of blue, I hosted a picnic on the boardwalk for the people who took my side. Before it was safe, the county surveyor's shoes, muddy smile, clean, Special Master Ramsey hat brim permanently honest, the harbor master arms crossed. Like a mast, the state biologist hands everywhere at once, pointing, measuring, blessing the retired judge, bourbon not required anymore. My neighbor who first slipped that email. We ate sandwiches that tasted like relief, and watched a class learn the etiquette of tide step, where you can note what you touch, leave the place truer than you found it. Are you going to tell them? The surveyor asked Chin, flicking toward the classroom, then the villas, then the pool, pretending with surprising dignity to be a tool. About the rider, I said. One day, maybe on a winter afternoon when the light is honest and the lesson will stick. That night, Caroline felt close enough to converse with. Grief is geography. Sometimes the wind shifts, and you hear the old city's traffic again. I set her bronze fragment beside the new stone and told her about the clause. You'd have liked it, I said, not for the vengeance, for the sentence. She hated pomp but loved precision. The only good threat she used to tell her interns is the one you don't have to use. The rider had been that kind of threat, silent patient making room for better endings. A week later, the state attorney filed something quiet but consequential, a misdemeanor forgery charge, against the notary who'd accommodated the Sunday deed, and a false instrument count for a board officer who had pressed submit on a filing she knew didn't deserve the verb. Not prison, but record. Consequence scaled to truth. Linda was not charged. The midnight text lived in the court's stern memory, and in her own, which might be the heavier sentence. She kept her head down, stayed through the training, and attended the reserve's volunteer day, carrying lumber on her shoulder like she was paying a tax. People can learn. She proved it the only way we accept transaction by transaction. Summer rolled its heat across the marsh, and with it, the sound I'd missed most kids, being plain kids somewhere, adults tried to turn into a spreadsheet. They caught fiddlers and named them wrong, which is a kid's right. They held ropes for divers and argued over whose knot was prettier. They stood at the plaque and read out loud because agreement sometimes needs a voice to become a promise. The reserve's first study, run by the biologist and a grad student with hair the color of wet cedar, tracked how our restoration changed what nested where. The data sang. The marsh relieved of concrete wash brightened. The boardwalk's shape matched wind patterns instead of arguing with them. The pier's shadow taught fish to congregate in new safe ways. I wrote a small grant for an outdoor mic so anyone online could hear brackish water tell jokes to weather. Thousands did. Some of them were HOA members from other places writing to ask for the syllabus on how not to embarrass yourselves. One evening, I found Linda alone at the end of the pier, looking not at the sunset but at the gradient where light admits defeat and begins to work differently. I read your father's journal, she said. She'd asked to borrow it 2 weeks earlier. The part's about patience. She laughed a little without joy. We built an institution on applause, she said. We measured ourselves by news segments and golf cart parades. You measured by lines and birds. She tapped the rail. I'm learning your units. I believed her. Not the way you believe a contract by signatures and penalties, but the way you believe a spring after watching it run clear for a month. Keep showing up, I said. Meetings. Work days. Don't hold a microphone until the habit is solid. She nodded. My sentence, she said, is meetings. We both laughed, which is a currency that spends anywhere. The writer's existence changed me more than it changed the island. Knowing I could have snapped my fingers and taken every bolt made mercy feel less like softness and more like choice. The reserve existed not because I lacked a hammer, but because I decided a lab conducts more justice than a wrecking crew. That isn't sainthood, it's engineering. On the anniversary of the ribbon cutting that tried to rename my beach, we held our own ceremony. No band, no confetti. We rang a brass ship's bell once, for each person who had held the line when it mattered. The clerk who pointed to the notary number, the UPS store manager with the honest log, the surveyor who admitted a lazy line, the deputy who said, "Keep it boring," the banker who shut up and listened, the insurer who chose endowment over theater, the biologist who measured with mercy, the harbor master who wrote birth numbers like scripture, the judge who tapped a bylaw and changed a town, the neighbor who forwarded a subject line. Then I rang one more time for Caroline. The note climbed the pilings and ran down the boardwalk and bounced off the pool's skin and finally rested on the marsh like a coin, slid into a jar that will never be full by design. We ate simple food. We told stories my father would have edited for length. We went to sleep early under a wind that did not have to carry generators. On my desk, the writer sits beneath a sheet of glass, not as a threat, but as an exhibit in a small museum of the way we chose to live. Kids press their palms against the glass and ask how words can turn a hotel into a classroom. I tell them the truth. Words are just screws. You choose the wood. Late when the island is a whisper and the pier is a line drawn by a quiet, confident hand, I read the clause again and tuck it back in the file. It's there for the future I hope never arrives. Insurance like the stone under Caroline's name. It doesn't brag, it waits. The tide comes, the tide goes. The island keeps its ledger, and somewhere inland, a board member in a different town pauses before signing a map that lies. That pause is our monument. Power isn't loud, it's patient. I learned that the hard way, standing on a beach where my wife's name was scraped into sand by people who thought applause could replace law. Paper isn't romantic, but it remembers. Maps, deeds, bylaws, tide charts, hold your line with them, and you don't need to shout. You don't have to burn what you can rebuild smarter. Mercy counts more when you could have crushed and chose to convert. If you're facing your own HOA moment, someone bigger, louder, certain collect receipts, not rage. Find the clause they didn't read. And when the tide turns, use its strength, not your temper. If this story hit home, tell me where you're watching from and what line you're holding in your life. Drop your city and local time in the comments, subscribe for more HOA justice tales, and share this with someone who needs a reminder. Patience is a win condition.